all the things that I'm talking about in this series are interconnected for obvious reasons at the same time period. And they're related in terms of causality. I talked about democracy 2 weeks ago, and sort of the further push of democratization. Once you get it established that you're going to have regular elections, you're going to have hopefully free and fair elections, and then people say, well, who gets to vote? And off we go with these ongoing debates about the working class and women and African Americans. And in each case, there's a struggle, a long struggle. I used to say that the students at Georgetown, and it was part of their political education. Most of them did not have this information walking in, already being well educated. I said, right now, maybe too casually, people take for granted the democratic ideal as the right way to organize, and not just here, but in many parts of the world. But I went on to say that is the result, the product of a struggle that went on many different fronts for a long time. Indeed, there's a sense of it is still going on. So that was the beginning. And Rob said to me afterwards, in an exchange, isn't this related to the Industrial Revolution? That is democratization. And I said to him what I need to now say, absolutely. I think the real expansion of the electorate and so forth is related to dynamics that were set in motion by industrialization, urbanization, labor unions, all of it. So that was the first business. Last week I talked about political economy and the emergence of this whole really fundamental, earth-shattering idea, which we take for granted, and that is growth, economic growth. It's such a simple idea, but such a compelling idea that for centuries, millennia, people have assumed that economic life was static. That there was only so much you could have, and therefore there was this struggle between those who were able, for various reasons, to get rich in a certain place, and everybody else, and they held on to it tight-fistedly, because if it were spread around, they would be poor. So it was the poor and the rich forever. And then in this period, related to industrialization, there dawns this idea, this possibility, we can expand the pie. Indeed, we can expand the pie again and again and again. And we're living in that, obviously. And by the way, related to that, as I said, there was this really strong pressure on governments to help it. Once people became aware that was a possibility, you can just see people turning to civil authorities and saying, well, can you help us with this? And there were two roads that went in very different directions. One is mercantile. And by the way, this thing I'm talking about historically is very much a part of the news today. Mercantile policies, pour it into our own country and as much as possible hold on to what we've got and, if you will, protect ourselves against those foreign influences. And then the other idea, which we associate with Adam Smith, the wealth of nations, plural, the wealth of nations, and let's open up those borders and allow for trade and create a global division of labor. Literally, that idea is in Adam Smith. And it was a kind of breathtaking idea. And there were certain governments tended to be in Reformed Protestant countries, I have to say. There were certain governments, the Netherlands, the English, eventually this country and so forth, who are more inclined to embrace that, and that led to growth in those countries in a way that it did not in the other countries. It was the continent of Europe versus the countries I named. And once that happened, there was then an enormous expansion in the power of the countries which experienced economic growth. Let me say that again: an enormous expansion in the power vis-a-vis the other countries of economic growth. Once they got that economic growth and got, you might say, on that train, and the train kept moving forward, they dramatically increased their power vis-a-vis other countries for obvious reasons. They had more resources, they had more wealth, which leads to today's topic. By the way, just one other thing on that. I said that there was a very complicated relationship between Reformed Protestantism and economic growth, which on the whole was affirmed, but with hesitation and caution. Reformed Protestants, unlike many other Christians, tended to embrace the idea of economic growth and to participate in it. with a caution. I remember Emily sitting here nodding as I said the next thing. They were worried about its spiritual consequences. If you get rich, won't you maybe get devoted to mammon? Mm-hmm. Mammon is a great symbol of what? The spiritual peril of wealth. And that became a great concern, and frankly, it was a concern which over time was eclipsed because of the, you might say, the enormous benefits in terms of power, but also prosperity of the countries that had embraced it. Now, today I want to talk about, you might say, the geopolitical consequence of what I've just been discussing. Everybody with me? The geopolitical consequence. There are some countries that are getting rich. There are some countries that are getting powerful. Other countries that not so much. And there's especially when you look at the wealth and power of those countries in the North Atlantic. In the North Atlantic, vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Vis-a-vis the rest of the world, they are just leaping forward compared to those others. Which gives rise to what I'm characterizing up here as the new imperialism. The new imperialism. Reaching out into the wider world, taking possession of the wider world. Literally. Taking possession of the wider world in colonies, which then create a global economy. This is the beginning of a true global economy, because they're knocking down barriers, but they're taking control of India, they're taking control of China, they're trying to take control of Japan, they're just moving, you might say, across the face of the earth in pursuit of economic goods, but also other things too. Now, why do I characterize this as a new imperialism? Very important conceptual point. I think imperialism, in the sense of one people taking control of another, dominating them, exploiting them, that's almost coterminous with human history. At least it's coterminous with the civilized world. That is, countries that begin to develop the resources that we characterize as civilization. I mean, think about the Bible. The Bible is filled with empires. The Syrian Empire, the Egyptian Empire, and certainly the Roman Empire. There's a wonderful book up here I was just noting that talks about Paul's view of empire, because that was the world he inhabited. So there's empire, and on through the Middle Ages. And then you get on the threshold of the beginning of the modern world, you get this penetration out, and it's very cautious initially, this penetration out into, especially the Americas, by certain countries in Western Europe, 1492 and all of that stuff. Sending people out there, and the leaders initially are Roman Catholics, not Protestants. The Roman Catholics in Spain and Portugal, sending those tentacles out into what we now think of mainly as Latin America. And then these initial attempts, cautious but gradually take hold in North America of little colonies, New England, Virginia, and so forth. Now that brings me to the key point. All of that, much of that, not all, much of that early activity was imperial but not colonial. Imperial but not colonial. Let me say why. To create a colony is to put your imprint on a foreign land, a foreign people, in a different way than simply exploiting. The Spanish were very good. The Portuguese were very good at dominating and exploiting. They didn't create large colonies. That was a much later development. Initially, they just sent troops over and intimidated the native population. Think of Mexico and Peru and so forth. Exploited that population militarily in order to get certain resources, gold and others. But they didn't create colonies. You didn't have Spanish colonies. Because what is a colony? You send your people out there to create something comparable to the society back home. Now, and by the way, the Brits in particular began to explore that before this thing that I'm talking about here. They already were beginning to set up colonies. Actually, they didn't. It took a long time for them to develop a policy. Initially, as we know well, the colonists were refugees. They were refugees from the old world, trying to find some degree of opportunity to practice their religion in particular in a serious way. But gradually they begin to develop a policy. They have the various companies who are creating, and more as commercial enterprises, a colony in Virginia, a colony in the Carolinas, a colony in colonies in New England and so forth. But what happens once this surge in economic activity takes place, the emergence of this really powerful force that is a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution. Once that happens in the 1800s, 1700s, and 1800s, it gives rise to a new kind of imperialism, which is deliberately predicated on colonialism. A new kind of imperialism, which is deliberately predicated on colonialism. Everybody with me on this? And why would you do that? Well, it's a more effective means of control. So you send Brits out to India to create what? Not a colony or a set of colonies, but to sort of penetrate your culture into their culture so as to create a kind of Latin. And of course, if you want to use cynical economic logic, this is the best way to really control those resources. This is the best way to really control the human resources and others out there. And so you get a whole series of countries. And let me just give you a list so that we know who the players are. A whole series of countries, the French, the Brits, the Italians begin to get into this, the Germans begin to get into this, and eventually the Americans. Let me underscore that for a long time, the Americans, for maybe obvious cultural, political reasons, were skeptical about the value of it. And they took umbrage at it until the Spanish-American War. Spanish-American War, they win that war, and they get the Philippines as a sort of prize, and Cuba. And they begin to say, this is for reasons I'm about to get into, this is a good thing. So the new imperialism is characterized by, you might say, a much more invasive and effective means of control, and that is the establishment of colonies all over the world, in China, in Indochina, and so forth. And these colonies become a kind of culture unto themselves. As the native population begins to absorb, I can't help but think, even as I speak, those Indians who speak with a British accent, it's sort of penetrating into the very identity of the people. And hopefully, if you succeed, you sort of draw them in the direction of everything about your way of life that you like, everything about including your religion, that you think is good, exemplary, and so forth. Turn them into Brits, turn them into German-speaking people, etc. So this is you might say, the enormous strategy, the strategic development here, and it's very effective. It produces very, very clear. I'm going to now cast a larger picture here and say it creates what sometimes is characterized as the European partitioning of the world. The partitioning of the world. I mean, just think of Africa. French Africa, English Africa, German Africa,
Belgian.
What?
Belgian Africa.
Exactly. All these little sort of partitions, and eventually all this is woven into treaties and legal, so it has a kind of legal color to it. So it is very, you might say, it is very successful, and it is very long-lasting in its implications. Indeed, if we had time to talk here, we don't, fortunately. You could talk about the ripple effects of this well into the late 20th century and even into the 21st. It sort of sets in motion, like the other things I've been talking about. It sets in motion a long-standing trend of events until the First World War, the first serious eruption in this trend. I'll get to what that means in a moment. So we can bookend this and say, roughly in the 1860s and 1870s, you begin to get the new style imperialism. It moves forward, and countries that are not involved in it, like Germany initially, feel the need to get involved in it. The competition they need to win, or at least have some success in. And that prevails rather well until the First World War. It doesn't go away, but to use the fashionable word problematize, in the First World War in a way that changes the equation somewhat. That's at the very end of my thought. What is the Reformed response to this? To me, it's striking that on the whole, the Reformed Protestant response to this is affirmative and even enthusiastic. Yes! Right! Go! This is just, and then words like it's providential. It's in the providence of God that the European nations should move out into the wider world and take possession. Now, there are a couple of exceptions, and I want to note them because they're important. You've heard of Roger Williams. I think, he's got a complex religious identity and a complex religious history. The Baptists claim him as their guy, but he's very reformed. He's a Calvinist. He's got a Calvinist outlook, and he is very sort of open. He's a Puritan. The interesting thing about Roger Williams, however, is that he's a dissident Puritan. It's sort of wonderful image to think about. You know, the whole idea of creating a holy commonwealth with everybody sort of marching down the right path. And then there are exceptions. And one of those exceptions, the most notable exception, arguably, is Roger Williams. Clergy, very, very devout clergy. He gets kicked out of Massachusetts State College. Well, very quickly. And the main thing he gets kicked, I mean, there's several things he gets kicked out for, but the main thing he gets kicked out for is challenging the legitimacy of the land claim made by Massachusetts State College. They're occupying land, we're developing the land, they say it's our land, and Roger Williams says, well, what is the basis of that claim? Well, we got a charter. We got a charter from the Crown. To which he replies, well, what business has the Crown got giving away land which is already occupied by what we today would call Native Americans? They didn't like it. That was a very, very radical claim at the time. And they said, yeah, well, what possibly could we do differently? He said, well, it's very simple. If you're going to do this kind of thing, then I'm not saying you should stay home. You know, you can come over across the Atlantic, but then you need to confront the people who are already living here and ask their permission to maybe, you know, trade for something, strike a deal with them for some land. In other words, the original source of the grant has got to be the people living here, not some monarch over there. Hello? Well, and by the way, that was the practice that he followed when he got kicked out. Because he went to what we now know as Rhode Island, set up a colony there, and he set up that colony on the basis of a negotiated settlement with the local tribe, traded with them in order to get certain land rights. So that's one example. That's a dramatic example. And by the way, the interesting thing about it, it's so much a deviation from the norm that it's kind of breathtakingly striking. Another one, and this is a quite much later figure. You heard this name I've used, I think, maybe a couple of times here before, the tongue twister. There was this very important theologian in the 19th century, early 1800s, named Friedrich Schleiermacher. Tongue twister. Schleiermacher. I've been told that's kind of a test of your ability to speak German well. You can say names like Schleiermacher. Anyway, Friedrich Schleiermacher is looked upon today as one of the great figures in the history of modern theology, and especially Reformed theology. Like he's up there with Calvin, Karl Barth, Schleiermacher, one of the three or four greats. Very innovative, creative thinker. He was a critic of imperial policy before Germany got involved in it, and wrote eloquently on that it's utterly wrong. It's utterly wrong for you to impose your values or your way of life on somebody else by force. He just said bluntly, this is unchristian. And anybody who claims, even in the name of religion, he said, anybody who claims in the name of religion that this is appropriate is just wrong. They're just wrong. So he is a German note, a very outspoken critic of the, shall we say, the imperial idea, but there are exceptions. For the most part, and especially in this period, when you might say the wheels of imperialism are really getting started. People are enthusiastically embracing it and moving forward. The vast majority, deep thinkers, clergy, people in the pew, and not just in this country, in Scotland, in the Netherlands, even in Switzerland, believe it or not, even in Switzerland, I say that because the Swiss are so proudly, defiantly, sort of independent themselves. In all these places, on the whole, the reaction, practically, theologically, religiously, to the new imperialism was go for it. Go for it. And we're going to help. Clergy, churches, we're going to help. Now, why would they do that? Especially, I thought maybe they needed to read Roger Williams. Maybe they certainly were aware of Schleiermacher. Obviously, they just brushed that aside. He's just wrong. Well, what terms do they say that? This is a very important moment in the development of reform. Very important moment. Well, the initial reason, and it's predictable when you just think about it for 30 seconds. They saw this penetration by colonial means into the wider world as an enormous opportunity for evangelization. Yeah. Enormous opportunity. And you can imagine the sermons that would be preached on this. Out there in the hinterlands of the rest of the world, how could people ever hear the gospel of Jesus Christ without something like this? I think Schleiermacher and Williams would have had answers to that question, but they looked at it and said, look, there's just all kinds of walls being knocked down, particularly in China and Japan and so forth. Cultural barriers are being knocked down, and here's the next point. We are able to send missionaries into those places in a way that we previously could not, and set them up, situate them, so that they're don't have to worry about violence or attacks on them. They're protected by the colonial authority. This was very interesting to me. This is a part of Christian history I think sometimes is not well understood, and it's not discussed, not even mentioned. And that is, this is the great period in the whole history of Christianity. This is the big surge in missionary activity, global missionary activity. More than I've read now several historians of Christian missions who talk about all the way from Paul to the present, and they say again and again, this is the period, right in this roughly 30, 40-year window, this is the period in which Christian missions explodes around the world. And it was particularly attractive, and by the way, it was a very organized effort. Money was raised, organizations were formed, and in particular, there was a great appeal to younger people, college students, seminary students, and so forth. You can go out into the wider world and serve Christ in a way that would be dramatically pathbreaking compared to what you would do if you went to a local parish in Maryland. Go to India, not Maryland. They didn't say don't go to Maryland, but the implication was this is kind of a heroic adventure in the name of Jesus Christ. Several thousand missionaries were mobilized in a whole series of countries. Scotland was a hotbed of this. England, of course. The United States was right at the forefront of it, especially after the Spanish-American War. And there was an organization, you'll love this, there was an organization called the Student Volunteer Movement in the United States. It was a kind of ecumenical organization, not one denomination or another, just student volunteer movement. The slogan of the Student Volunteer Movement was evangelization of the world in this generation. Let that sink in. The evangelization of the world in this generation. That's a sobering thought. But by the way, several universities sort of cooperated in this. They say I went to Yale Divinity School. Yale Divinity School is a hotbed of projection of missionaries out into China in particular. There's a whole Yale in China program to this day, which is derives from it. There were over 500 separate mission stations scattered throughout what we view today we characterize as the Global South. These are places in which there was a concentrated, organized missionary effort And it will not surprise you that while it entailed evangelization, it also entailed medicine and education, two other big parts of this. And the people who were involved in it, and a lot of these people were short-term missionaries. They'd be out there for 2 or 3 years and come back, and some were not, but a lot of them. So there was a constant rotation. But think of all these people spreading out into the wider world, with experience suddenly in Africa, experience suddenly in East Asia or whatever. It becomes a whole sort of dynamic within the countries involved as well as in the wider world. But it gives imperialism a very, very righteous quality. You may have gotten into that country by gunboat diplomacy, but now you have missionaries flooding in with the hope of what? Evangelizing the whole country. And of course, that was a kind of wonderfully, you might say, inspiring optimism on their part. We today probably look at it and look, what are they thinking? But they were thinking, no, the gospel, if it's preached right, and we provide this kind of combination of education and medical care and so forth, there will be a natural attraction. The gospel will obviously be appealing to these people. But the other big justification for it is development. The missionaries were very impressed, and the people sending them were very impressed by the idea that out there is this poverty, this enormous poverty and backwardness, but just terribly backward. I mean, and that's what they encountered. They encountered so many places where the conditions were just, from their point of view, just appallingly impoverished. So you have this dynamic coming in, businesses coming in, supported by governmental activity, and the possibility of what? Developing the resources of that country. Part of the thing I talked about last time, sort of righteous economic and other forms of development. And of course, in many places, there was significant economic activity taking place of a modern sort that previously didn't exist. And again, from the point of view of Reformed Protestants in particular, that advancement, that development, the development of the resources of the country, the development of the people, yes, that's a good thing. That is providential. Question. I'm sure it crossed your mind. I hope it's crossed your mind. Yeah, but you're ruling those people. You're controlling their lives. And the reason you're able to do it is because you've got some guns. You've got military resources in particular, and eventually economic sort of control of their lives as well. You're kind of dictating to them what their lives should be. Isn't that wrong? Schleiermacher's question. How can I be reconciled with Christian ethics? And here was the answer. Well, we don't plan to be here forever. This is kind of a transitional step. It may take several generations, but this is a transitional step on the way to, and here was the vision, on the way to a whole world of independent nation states. A whole world of independent nation states filled with what? Modern people, self-reliant, capable of taking charge of their affairs well. And of course, the implication would be now they're not. Right now they're not. They're and this sometimes is metaphorically literally this. They're children. They're like children. They lack in all kinds of ways the ability really to make good judgments for themselves. So you get images which actually begin to start getting woven into law, protectorate, the protectorate, meaning we're going to, for a while, the British were particularly strong about it, insisting upon it. Part of this mission, the mission we have, sometimes they use that religious language, the mission we have is to enable these people eventually to become fully self-governed. So a whole world full of independent nation states, hopefully filled with Christians. Even dominated by Christians. Providential. That's the vision. But in the short run, to make sure that things stay on track, we have to stay in control. So that's the mindset of our spiritual forebears, for the most part, in this period. And by the way, the United States becomes fully a part of this once the Spanish-American War takes place. Previous American reservations about imperialism fade; they don't go away entirely. Let me just jump ahead real quickly and then come back. Some of you, if you're thinking about the impact of the First World War, might remember a guy called Wilson, Presbyterian, son of the manse, very uber Presbyterian, who had this idea that the world should be structured around a league of nations, independent nations, and not yet, but independent nations, and those independent nations should be replaced this terrible world of empires that we've been living in. We've been a war of monarchs and czars and all that. We need to replace that, and that was a big part of his move in the negotiations after the First World War to move things in. And I hope you see why this is a kind of secularized version of what I just described. Moving things in the direction of a League of Nations. Now, very quickly, the European powers pushed back, and they ended up with a lot of protectorates. But protectorates is a way of kind of saying, this is interim. This is on the latest. I hope you see. A Catholic in particular would say that the Protestant vision all along has been a world of independent nations. It's rarely articulated, but they would say that's the way Protestants. Now, to complete this, let me talk about, and the phrase I've got up here, and I just want to emphasize it because I think it's a good way of summarizing benign colonialism. These Reformed Protestants essentially said there is such a thing as benign colonialism and war practice. Good for them. It's not good for us, too. It's good for them, and ultimately it leads the whole world in the right direction. It's a huge development in the evolution of Protestant Christianity. The sort of shift in the direction of an imperial project, it just would have been unthinkable before. Becomes now is not only thinkable but practical and embraced. Fairly soon, however, even in the period we're talking about here, there began to be second thoughts about it. And it's fascinating to watch the interplay of the proponents and the critics, because it had critics and it had internal critics in the Reformed Protestant world, among others. I was startled to learn. I don't know why I didn't know this earlier, but in reading about it, I was startled to learn that among its first critics were missionaries. Some of its most strident critics were missionaries themselves. What were they talking about? Because the missionaries encountered these cultures and began to, these foreign cultures, and began to appreciate them and respect them. And this is the period in which you get for the first time talk about the development of an indigenous Christianity. You know that phrase, indigenize means to sort of blend into the existing culture, not transform the existing culture, but to blend into and to incorporate the existing culture into Christianity, rather than Christianity being understood as the imposition of a foreign way. And this is particularly true in places where there was a very well-developed and sophisticated culture. China is the obvious case. India in a different way. But these are places where you didn't have primitive tribes. You had highly sophisticated religions, and for example, they would encounter Hindus who were in the minds of some of the missionaries just extraordinarily appealing people whose moral standing commanded respect. You get the missionaries saying, wait a minute. There's a problem with this idea of us just imposing a good life on other people. That's a problematic idea. Maybe we need to rethink it. How much rethink is another question. But I hope you see how that's a kind of subversive idea. If the local culture is something that's perceived as not just something to be overcome, but something to be appreciated, you're on your way to a different way of thinking. A second group who begin to push back, and this, I think, perplexed a lot of people on this side of the world. You're sending missionaries out. You're involved in this sort of imperial project. And then what happens is the project begins to produce converts. Now let me be very clear here. On the whole, measured in numbers, the attempt initially to create, and I mean greater, on the whole, the attempt to create a Christian society out of India or something is a failure. We know it's pretty obvious it's a failure. And of course, it just kind of completely subverted the idea over time of the evangelization of the world in this generation, or maybe in the next generation. So we're not talking about huge numbers here. We're talking about, in almost every case, there are a couple of exceptions, but almost in every case, the creation of, through converts, a minority population, a minority Christian group. Minority here, minority there, minority whatever. There were a couple of exceptions. But now here's the point. How do those Christians, those newly minted Christians, or even more their children growing up, how do they think about this colonialism? What is their view of it? And it will not surprise any of you to hear that some of them, not all of them, reacted by saying, wait a minute, this idea that we're not worthy of self-rule, that's kind of a disrespectful attitude to have. We're certainly worthy human beings like other human beings. And I'm not quite to the word right here, but I'm going to use it. Don't we have a right to self-determination? Don't we have a right to these are the Christian converts in various parts of the world. So you got a double pushback here. You got the missionaries who are saying, wait a minute, you've got these local Christians who are beginning to say, this is problematic, we've got to do something about it. And let me add, oftentimes, even when the missionaries did not produce converts, they produced people who were influenced by Christian activity, especially Christian schools. For example, the great hero initially in the development of Chinese nationalism was a figure called Sun Yat-sen. You've all heard of Sun Yat-sen. He was a medical doctor. But Sun Yat-sen got his education entirely in missionary schools and had an immense respect for things Christian. But he was a nationalist. And he rose up, eventually promoted a rebellion, sort of Chinese nationalists being summoned to throw off the imperialists in the name of, and sometimes he would actually use language like this, in the name of values that all good religious people believe in. That is self-determination. I don't want to make too much of this, but there are a number of cases where you've got very distinguished nationalists in these countries which are under this subject to colonialism, which become very important figures in the drive for self-determination. Typically, it doesn't happen until around the time of the Second World War. We got a huge explosion of that self-determination stuff right after the Second World War. Now, with just a couple of minutes to go in my presentation, let me just say what happened in the First World War, what the First World War signified. I said at the beginning of my remarks that the First World War is kind of a bookend, the other end of this period, which things change after the First World War. Well, first of all, the First World War had a profoundly discrediting effect upon the claims of Christian nations that were imperialist powers, that they were paragons of virtue, because they were killing each other. Terrible, you might say, civil war in Western Europe. And in the eyes of people who had been converted to Christianity, or at least been educated by Christians, this was a kind of striking revelation of well, I've read one author who said the spiritual bankruptcy of the West. It's a little strong, but it really had, it undermined profoundly the legitimacy of claims that what was always being done by these powers was righteous. That was the first thing. But then you get this thing that I referred to earlier, with the world. In the aftermath of the First World War, you get a strong embrace by important political currents in the West of self-determination as something which is desirable globally. Self-determination as something which is desirable globally. And you begin to see that in the Versailles Treaty with the development of new nation states out of the structures of Europe in order to honor self-determination there in a way, especially in Eastern Europe, in a way that had not been done previously. And hints of the desirability of doing that in the wider world. Nothing more than hints. I don't want to exaggerate. It takes a long time before that sort of the critique of colonialism should become effective. Indeed, as I suggested, it really doesn't become fully effective until after the Second World War. When you begin to get the surge of proliferation of nations around the world, over 200 now. But that takes time. That's sort of the product of the things I've already talked about, and then the next debacle, the Second World War, which only adds to the kind of discrediting of Western pretension. Let me stop there and invite your comments, questions, rebuttals. Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. As I was listening to you talking about what's occurred in history, and I'm thinking now, and maybe post-Second World War, it seems like what's happened in the last half of the last century, roughly speaking, is a lot of these colonial tendencies, per the way you described it, have pulled back. So, for example, Australia is an independent country. It used to be part of England at one point. India, countries in the Middle East. I'm also reminded a little bit. I don't think this was a colonial situation, but the intent of trying to bring good things to other people is maybe good, and even Christianity. The problem is the force of the hand, and you're not really competent, you local people, to govern yourself. We know what's best for you, but you kind of articulated it was sort of a heavy hand in the time period you're talking about. But I'm thinking, like, for example, South Korea. And I may not have it all exactly right, but it seems to me that it's interesting how South Korea has developed over the past, 50 years or so.
Absolutely.
And it hasn't been I don't believe it's a colonial power, but there was a lot of impact of Western, I don't know, industry, technology, whatever you want to view it. And they blossomed without being a colony, so to speak, in the old mold that you talked about. So have we transitioned? I guess my question is a little bit, in today's time, have we transitioned to a different way of a combination? I don't know what the right word is, but respect or self-determination, as you use that term, but also being able to share things that are advantageous. So individual parts of the world can continue to grow, become more prosperous, let's say, not just prosperous, but better for the people that are living there by sharing technology or sharing things more globally around the world, as opposed to the force fit kind of approach of the colonial thing that you talked about.
Well, that's the key issue. Colonialism, by definition, is force fit. You're taking control of the society, and you're robbing you can have collaborators locally, but ultimately the decisions are being made elsewhere. Decisions. And as I tried to indicate, that begins to be called into question already in this period, and in keeping with what you just said, over time, more and more and more, both the will to do it and the will to do it declines. Takes a long time because there are economic and other motives for it, and military motives, I might add, and the desire to resist it grows. That is roughly the story of the 20th century. And the 21st is more complex. Let me throw in one other. Sort of the seeds that were sown in this period. Small numbers of Christians in the wider world. gave rise to, it took about 50 years, but it gave rise to it gave rise to national churches, independent national churches in so many countries. So you have the Presbyterian Church of Cameroon or whatever. And by the way, colonialism initially involved control of the religious of the locals as well. They didn't have independent churches. Over time, there's been a drift in the direction of independent national churches, the Protestant model, if you will, no defining center, local churches, and that dynamic is one of the reasons why Christianity has become, in the last 50 years, the fastest growing religion in the world. It's so fascinating to observe how at the beginning it was just tiny little seed. And I think that the indigenization that's represented by having a national church really gave a spur to growth in many places. It's not happening everywhere, but many places it is. And that has become, it seems to me, such an interesting way to think about the original aspiration. Now, I don't want to suggest the world is being evangelized in any simple sense. It's very complex. There's a kind of almost neck competition between Islam and Christianity. But at the moment, Christianity is the fastest growing religion in the world, and the growth is almost entirely in what today we would characterize as the global south. I'm sorry for the long speech. I saw a hand back there. Yes, sir.
I'm very familiar with the missionary work in Egypt. The Presbyterian Church established the Synod of the Nile in the 1850s. And I'm a kind of a product of that.
Good for you.
Missionary. The question I have, I mean, you're a master of theology and a professor of government. The question I have is, was there a nexus between government, in this case, the U.S. government and the Presbyterian Church in America in this missionary work? I'm familiar with Egypt, with Jordan, with the Levant, and Lebanon, Syria. And there's always the question in my mind, what kind of two of my great uncles who were sons of one of the very early Presbyterian ministers in Egypt went to Harvard Medical School. One of them was the first Egyptian to attend Harvard Medical School as a result of kind of being sons of the Presbyterian minister.
Sure.
So was the government and the church connected?
Well, I would say broadly the following, and it is a sweeping generalization in answer to your question. It's a complex issue, actually. But I would say broadly what was the case between the time of the Civil War, aftermath of the Civil War in this country, and up through about the age of the period of Eisenhower. There was a very intimate connection between, not Presbyterians as such, but I would say the mainline Protestant denominations tended to dominate public life. They tended to dominate in terms of who was, and particularly in the State Department. State Department was just filled with mainline Protestants, by which I mean Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Methodists, Episcopalians, and sometimes Baptists. And I'm talking about the white churches, of course, not the African American churches. So you would find in the halls of government, and not just at the federal level, but the state level, of course, which is the federal level in this case, which is the most important. People who identified themselves as Protestants, oftentimes something more specific than that, Reformed Protestants, thought in those terms. Some of those people, I don't want to exaggerate, some of those people were very, very self-consciously trying to apply their faith in public life. And in their minds, this colonial project was fully justified on religious grounds. That's, in a way, that's the point I'm trying to make here. It was fully justified on religious grounds, and they, because they were absolutely well-intentioned in them, piously well-intentioned, they had a hard time comprehending why it might be public. So that's the answer. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a product of Protestants in Turkey.
Yes.
Missionary work there, and I've read quite a bit about a particular missionary in the southeastern part of Turkey. And he was very successful. Medical doctor, missionary, created colleges, hospitals, clinics, churches, and that was a very strong Protestant community where my ancestors grew up. The problem, in retrospect, is yes, they were successful in that what turned out to be a minority community of Turkey. And then you've got this self-determination that gets layered on top, primarily after the First World War, but you saw it in the rest of the Middle East after the Second World War. And when you leave it to the population for self-determination, the majority, quote, wins.
Yep.
And all these little reform communities suffer.
They do suffer, and that's just I hope everybody followed that. That's just a perfect summary of the sort of the political dynamic of war in one place after another. But let me just add to that, because several of these comments, and by the way, these are just, I speak in a number of churches, and this is so interesting. What's happening now, I've experienced in other churches. Some people say, well, I'm from such and such, and we've heard one story, we heard another story, and it's such fascinating, and to my mind, very sort of, I don't know, reassuring stories or something. But let me say now something about education. Reformed Protestants, of course, above all, have been the party of education. It's in our DNA. We create schools, we create colleges, we create universities, and it's in the missionary case, it was thought to be central to the mission project. It was part of the reasons I've already indicated. And the consequence of that very often is that in those countries, even though they're a minority, depends on the way the politics plays out, they're very influential in the wider culture because they are so highly educated and technical, competent in technical terms, whether it's medical doctors or lawyers or whatever. This is kind of the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists. They're sort of the factory for producing the professional class. That is highly educated people, etc. And that's bound to be influential, unless they're deliberately marginalized. It's bound to be influential in a society where even the majority of the population may be assimilated. Yes.
I'll make this a yes or no question.
Maybe.
Let's see how good a politician.
Do you think that the disregard of the establishment of borders in the Middle East after the First World War created generations of conflict because there's literally disregard for the borders were made between countries arbitrarily.
Exactly, that's the point, arbitrary.
And isolated or forced collaboration of peoples for centuries to try to realign their lives, which results in generations of conflict. Do you think that was a fault of the treaty that ended World War II because they disregarded the populations because of arbitrary borders?
Can I answer with more words than one? The answer is yes.
Okay, good.
But here's the complication that I would introduce. The thing that was driving was the idea that the world has to be organized in terms of nation states. That's something which was arrived at in modern European history, and our spiritual forebears were critical to that. Then you take that idea and you apply it to the whole world, where you've got all kinds of tribes and peoples and migrants, people moving from one place to another, because a very important part of the nation is territory, land claims that are very specifically laid out, because they had that idea in mind. And Wilson, of course, definitely had that idea. He thought he was doing a wonderful thing by affirming the idea of people's self-determination, national self-determination. All right, let's draw borders. The one kind of led naturally to the other. And if I were to fault them, I would say they embraced a little too quickly the idea that the nation is the preferred form globally. See? I'm sorry, too many words, but that's, but it's a wonderful question. Yes, sir.
I'm just following up on Bob's Stowe's point. My aunt was a missionary in Korea, and today, Bob, there are more Presbyterians in Korea than there are in the U.S.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And by the way, isn't that interesting? And it's a product of fairly recent developments. That sort of growth of and by the way, it's Presbyterians in particular. I have a wonderful Korean American friend who says, there's just something about the way that Presbyterians think which connect with the Koreans. There's just something about, I don't know what it is.
My question is, do you think this is what Jesus meant when he said, go out and make disciples of all nations?
Okay, that's a very wonderful question. It's a wonderful.
It's not a yes or no either.
It's not. It's not. Well, I think, I'm not sure the word nations is a good translation for the text. I'm not a biblical scholar, but that has been sort of the standard interpretation of that text. And then, of course, it leads naturally to a world of nations. So that's a caveat that I would introduce. But it seems to me, it's just, you can't read the Bible, the New Testament, that without getting a sense that this is a religion with universalist aspiration that is projecting out. It's in Jesus, but even more, it's in Paul. Now think about Paul moving around in two ways. One, there's this crucial thing at the Jerusalem Council in the book of Acts. I'm sure all of you know that you might say the beginning of Christianity as we know it. In the sense, the question is, do you have to be a Jew in order to be a Christian? Jerusalem Council says no, you don't have to be circumcised, and therefore you can, these Gentiles can be part of it. We're all Gentiles, I see. So that's a crucial turning point. The other thing is, once that decision has been made, and Paul very much favors it, then he goes out and creates Corinth and all these other places, and you might say creates a kind of model for an example for steady expansion out into the wider world. Now, the interesting thing is there have been periods in history, like the beginning of the church, the first couple of centuries, when that was taken very seriously, and then century after century after century when it was not. And then suddenly, it's taken very seriously again. There have been periods when when Christians generally have reacted to their situation without much of a sense of missionary responsibility at all. That's my great question. Yes,
Bruce, I'm going to ask a question, and as moderator, I think I'm going to suggest this be the last question.
But
we have
Please invite Bruce back next week.
So I'm curious, the Cuba story interests me from the Spanish-American War.
Yeah.
The part of the overall thrust of what you're talking about is, the chance to go out and evangelize the world, everything has in some ways been sort of supporting, conquest and so
Yep.
on. In other cases, it doesn't seem like it's a part of it at all, and maybe it's like an after-the-fact justification. But I'm just struck. Any thoughts about like the Cuba? Was this just a military thing, and then we went in afterwards? So can you explain that more?
Well, no. I think I can be brief. I think there were parts of this, especially in that particular administration, McKinley. You hear about him a lot these days.
Yes.
I think there was just a sort of naked imperialism. We've got. I'm going to be terrible. We've got the cards. We can play them. And then having won the war, I mean that's a crucial part. It's sort of a taste develops here, And I think it surprised them that they would get control of the Philippines. But McKinley was really shocked by that. And then they got control of the Philippines and thought, what are we going to do in the Philippines? I have to give you a quotation here, which comes from McKinley. We will raise them up, 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 until they attain the level of Kansas City.
So, that's great. Can I ask one?
No.
What, I just have one
So
follow-up
you know,
question.
the way I'm answering it in a two-part step.
I got-
Conquest followed by pretty it up.
Yeah, so, just one quick, question. Do you think we need to conquer Greenland because we need to bring Christianity to
Absolutely.
them?
Absolutely. It's right
Let Bob have one more question.
right at the top of my list.
What about you? Let Bob ask one more.
Actually, I want to re-evangelize Florida.
It's a lesser question than that. We have a new player on the scene in the 20th century, and that's Vietnam, who, to my knowledge, was never populated by U.S. missionaries,
Rich Catholics.
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 And you can argue whether or not the Vietnam War was a war of imperialism or colonialism. I don't think it was. Possibly we could argue that. But the other thing is, if you go to Vietnam today and you walk through what used to be Ho Chi Minh's, well, it's Ho Chi Minh
Ho Chi Minh
City,
City.
used to be Saigon, and anywhere from sort of north of Hanoi, it looks and feels like America. People want to speak English. They want to deal with technology. They want all the things that Americans want. And there's no Americans standing there with guns pointing at them now saying you must do this. It's a very,
It's soft power.
it's soft power.
That's what it is. It's soft power. And anybody who thinks soft power is not a reality needs to think a little more. Or experience the world. But let me say one thing really quickly, and then I'll honor his desire to get us out of here. I have not mentioned at all the theme of Protestant Catholic competition. It was a huge part of this. Struggle for control of particular countries, sort of the European struggle now projected onto the wider world. And there was oftentimes very difficult turf battles. But Vietnam, I would characterize as a Catholic country because of the French influence, and it was viewed that way by the Catholics. And there were the Philippines was viewed as a Catholic country, and that was part of the issue with McKinley. Well, how do we cleanse of this Catholic stuff? And so that also is part of the story, which unfortunately I'm going.
Bruce, I have a comment, not a question.
All right.
And that is, I see colonialism coming back again, which you hinted at, but it's because of resources,
Oh, yeah.
oil,
Well,
rare materials.
glad you brought that up. That was the original motive in many places. You know, they've got resources. We need to get them.
And it's
Bruce
the
needs to
new.
come back.
First of all, can we give Bruce a hand, not for clearing up his Bruce.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed it. We'll see if we can get 31 years out of you. Anyway, thank you very much for all